Hi, everyone. My name is Jasmine, and you are listening to Faithfully Uncool, my little corner of the internet where I talk about Christianity, spirituality, and life. I often find myself overthinking, overanalyzing, or just nerding out about my faith, so I figured I may as well do what all good nerds do and make a podcast. No matter where you are on your spiritual journey, Christian, a different believer, or undefined, I'm happy you're here and hope you learn something new for the road. Today, we're going to do an episode that briefly covers an idea that I've been really thinking about for a long time now and was triggered by a really interesting post by Candice Benbow over on Instagram. If you aren't familiar with Candice Benbow, I'll have her site and socials linked in the show notes. But she's a public theologian, Duke Divinity School grad, and author. I've been following her for years, and I just love her work. Her new book, Red Lip Theology, for church girls who've considered tithing to the beauty supply store when Sunday morning isn't enough, is on my reading list. And she posts really thought-provoking, funny, interesting commentary on her Instagram. And one post several weeks, maybe months back by now, got my attention. It read, "If the bulk of your conversation/time is spent still talking about the sin of white supremacy, and you have no plan for moving forward and establishing healthy spiritual frameworks and practices to replace the toxic ones, you could be stuck in the trap of deconstructing. I hope this year people continue to find the right resources and people to step out of the hamster wheel of deconstruction as it's been presented to them and move towards more generative possibilities of faith and wholeness." So those are Candice Marie Benbow's words, and huge disclaimer here that this post was a part of a series of longer statements. So it had several slides in the post, and I just read the slides that stuck out to me and kind of inspired this episode. But of course, she's a theologian with a social media page, and so this post was a lot bigger. So definitely will actually put the direct post in the show notes so that you can click on it and read through all the points that she made. Really brilliant. Absolutely encourage a follow, but just want to give that disclaimer that these are the parts of the post that stuck out to me, but it is from a much larger statement and ideas that she was expressing. So just want to encourage you to check the show notes for that resource. So that's the Instagram post that she put out. Those are Candice Benbow's words. And in this episode, I'd like to reflect on how I approach this and what it triggered for me and my own thinking. And it really got me thinking about how important it is for us to not get stuck in a period of deconstruction in your faith. Now, I think that deconstruction is an experience that can just be triggered for different people for different reasons, regardless of your faith belief system. I also think that you can deconstruct from many different things. My very first podcast episode that I put out is called "What is Deconstruction and Why Do Christians Keep Doing It?" And it kind of goes over some of the popular reasons that I see that Christians decide to deconstruct their faith or to have maybe a difference in values or difference in opinion of how they approach their faith. So for me, as someone who deconstructed my faith, I think it is an incredibly humbling question to ask yourself. How do you have a faith that's authentic to who you are? It's a scary question, but it's important. This was a question I asked myself a lot when I was a teenager, early in my deconstruction journey, where I was questioning my faith. For me, leaving Christianity wasn't easy, but it just felt authentic at the time. And that was always something that was a core value and belief of mine, is when you say who you are, regardless of what identity you're saying. So with your faith identity, Jasmine, when you say you're a Christian, does that make sense to you? Does that resonate with you and how you believe Christians should believe? And as a teenager, I really struggled with that because I had a lot of questions about the intellectual side of my faith, reasons for why do I believe what I believe. Why do people that aren't Christian all go to hell? Like, do I believe that being LGBTQ is wrong? Like, there were just certain things that were illogical to me. And I did not have the resources as I do now. And progressive Christianity was not a term really that I knew of as it is now to describe when you are questioning certain, let's call them certainties or fundamentalist ideals that people might carry into their faith that don't resonate with you or your value system as a person. And so I do think that there were times where when I believed that the Bible was just one thing, only had one interpretation, and anything outside of that interpretation was evil and wrong and sent me to hell, then it was really hard to have a period of deconstruction and come out the other side believing that I could be Christian. To me, the only option I saw was that if I look at the Bible differently than the most fundamentalist, strictest version I could possibly come to, then clearly I'm not a Christian because now I'm doing it all wrong. And I don't know if I want to do this right, if doing it right means that I don't support marginalized groups, or if doing it right means that I don't have interfaith dialogue, right? Like it was just this weird black or white way of thinking. And when I deconstructed my faith, I was quite young. I was about 14 years old. And what triggered it for me was that I had a sibling who had a different faith system than my own. And so it was very interesting to me that we could be raised in the same family and have very similar values because we have the same parents. However, you come out the other side believing something totally different than what I believe. Now, the question begs, why do I believe what I believe then? And so that was very jarring for a 14-year-old me who had sort of a sheltered view of the world and thinking everybody just kind of sees things the way I do. Everybody's sort of Christian, How could people not be? I think I may have said this story before, but I was talking with a friend when I was in middle school, and my friend was talking to me about how he didn't have church clothes. And I was like, oh, well, is your church just very relaxed? I know some churches don't really dress up. And he was like, no. And then I said, oh, I don't get it. Do you go to church naked? And he sort of looked at me like, there's no way she's that dumb. And he was like, if I don't have church clothes, then... And I said, oh, you don't go to church. And he was like, right. And that was like a really good friend of mine that I had in middle school. But I think about that conversation because it was a conversation I had in my formative years where the foundation I thought from was really everyone comes to faith at the same point that I do. And so imagine that kid recognizing that someone in her own family didn't have the same belief system. It totally rocked my world. And so the word that I used for it was not deconstruction because that was not the terminology that I had. But I do think that it's interesting when I see posts like Candice's post, because there was definitely a period where I was questioning my faith and I was identifying as agnostic. But as I read more, as I gained more resources and more knowledge, as I did religious studies in college, and as I recognized the progressive Christian viewpoints and how social justice and Christianity really combine, that opened my worldview to say, okay, there are aspects of a very perhaps fundamental Christianity or conservative Christianity that don't resonate with me and that I reject. However, I don't reject my entire faith system, but I do reject certain ways of thinking that I believe might be oppressive to people. And so that was a different take for me, and it helped me to come out, for lack of a better term, on the other side, I suppose, of deconstructing. to say, I'm a Christian and this is the kind of Christian that I am. And I think there's power in that because I do believe, as Candice echoes in this post, that you can be on a hamster wheel of deconstructing. And I love how she says to get to more generative possibilities of faith and wholeness. Sometimes deconstruction, it is interesting. It can feel stressful, it can feel lonely. I don't know if I would say deconstruction is generative. I think you sort of have to enter that period of reconstruction, whatever that looks like to you. If that looks like I'm now a progressive Christian, if that looks like I'm now not a Christian, I don't know what that might mean for everyone. But when you are reconstructing your faith, when you're in a period of reconstructing your beliefs and your value systems, especially if your deconstruction journey was paired with growing up, like it was for me, then that reconstruction period, whatever that looks like, I think is where the generative wholeness and possibilities are. That's just my take. And I think that's really beautiful. So today, what I want to talk about are the ways I think that you can reconstruct this deconstruction journey that you may be on, and what helped me to reconstruct my faith and to get to a point where I could say, maybe I don't look like every fundamentalist or conservative Christian, but I'm okay with that because I have an authentic faith that for me is a more progressive Christian way of being. If progressive feels too targeted for you or too strong of a word for you, liberal, if that feels too targeted or strong for you. I love the term by the Bible for normal people called adaptive faith, understanding that your faith is adaptive, understanding that your faith has a cultural context, that you bring a cultural context to the Bible when you read it, right? So being expansive and open-minded in that way. But I thought that this would be a nice episode to go over what steps in a reconstruction journey can look like. You know, if the goal is to move towards more generative possibilities of faith and wholeness, as Candice Marie Benbow says so beautifully, then, in my opinion, here's how we could get there. So, number one is to beware of echo chambers. Be mindful of trading one form of fundamentalism for another. I'm definitely not the first person to say this, but the goal of Reconstruction isn't to come out the quote unquote perfect progressive, whatever that means. The goal is to continue to learn, grow, and allow your faith to adapt to new knowledge and experiences. Not because you have no foundation, but because you recognize the intricacies of belief, of life, and even of scholarship, such as placing the Bible within its cultural context, or not imposing modern expectations onto an ancient text, like modern knowledge of science, for instance. And recognizing various types of literature are actually displayed in the Bible. However, again, you don't need to trade one form of fundamentalism for another. Instagram influencers and YouTubers shouldn't be the end-all be-all for how you think or need to feel about a subject. Your faith is your responsibility, and it's okay for it to be your own. What I'm saying here really leads into my next point as well, and that's number 2, to curate your faith. Ask yourself what truly matters to you. For me, something big in my deconstruction journey was that I wanted to have a core value of authenticity in my faith. And that meant that I didn't want my faith or my religion to be the reason that I was telling someone I believed in something that I really didn't understand, or that I really didn't believe, or that really didn't make sense to me. So at some point, you have to figure out what truly matters to you. Not even the people in your church or your family or your friends. Yes, these influences definitely matter. I'm not saying they don't matter. And this isn't an offhanded way of saying to follow your truth. But this is more of a way of me just saying, be honest with yourself about the fruit that's been good versus the fruit that's been bad in your life, theology wise. The truth is, when you're trying to reconstruct, you have to get to a point where you're able to rebuild, and you have to start making some decisions in order to rebuild. If you're deconstructing the castle, let's say, of your faith, and you decide that this has nothing else to offer me, I can't do this anymore, I'm done with the castle, all these bricks can just stay on the ground, then that's a decision. If you decide I'm going to rebuild this castle, but I'm going to leave some pieces out of it because I saw what they did and they weren't helpful, then that's a decision. Sometimes this can be really hard because our faith tradition may have taught us to do something that we were really scared to do or were taught was actually opposite to the Bible, and that's to trust ourselves. I don't believe that trusting yourself and trusting God are mutually exclusive ideals. Nor do I believe that you should be afraid of your own intuition or your own convictions and constantly decide, okay, if I feel something or I struggle with something, it must mean that I'm a bad Christian, or what I'm coming to the conclusion of is antithetical to the Bible and no one's ever seen it this way. And how could I ever figure this out? Like, sometimes we're in this downward spiral where we have to figure out that a part of Reconstruction is to be honest with ourselves about our convictions. And I don't think that that's necessarily wrong. I do not think that that brave journey you take to be self-aware and introspective and honest with yourself about your value system is wrong. And I wish you all the best with it. The next thing is to not give up on finding your true home, your true spiritual home, because this can be a really, really beautiful thing. And I honestly believe that if your reconstruction journey leads you to remain a Christian, that you deserve the right to have a very open and welcoming and loving church community and to not miss out on the beauty of fellowship. For some people, what leads them to deconstruction, unfortunately, is that they grew up in or encountered church communities with people that brought them a lot of pain. And so if that's you, I'm incredibly sympathetic to that. And if you're recognizing that you still want a church experience, but you just can no longer have it with the same church community that you had it before, then I think you absolutely 100% deserve to pursue that. So I would say don't give up on community. Deconstruction and shifting values can feel lonely and scary, but it doesn't have to be. Many people doubt or face confusion or have struggles that shake their faith. There are no perfect Christians. Many people wonder, do I believe this anymore? Can I believe this anymore? Especially when their faith hyper-focused on who was left out and pushed them into an us versus them mindset that left little room for gray areas or understanding of different experiences. So whatever your story may be, again, if your reconstruction, if your rebuilding of that castle is still centered in the Christian space, I think you should absolutely 100% seek out a real church home that is authentic to you and allows you to really come as you are and gives you that safe space to be able to learn and grow, gives you new insights into the Bible. And hopefully, if you encounter toxic theologies, you're in a worship space that allows you to challenge those and maybe even helps you to challenge those. Something that I am extremely grateful that my church does is that it hosts sort of a theology on tap course every month. And so we get this chance, depending on the topic of the month, to really speak openly about it. And the assumption is not everyone in this room is going to think identically on every issue that arises. But the expectation is that this is a space where we have the dialogue, where we do purposeful communication to let you know that asking questions and thinking deeply about your faith and maybe not being okay with the one and done simplistic answer that you may have been given is okay. Or maybe you are okay with that answer, but there's someone that wants to challenge it or wants you to be able to have a reason for why you believe the way you believe. And honestly, that's good to have. So, whatever the case might be, I think open dialogue is so important. So, hopefully, you're in a community that allows that too. We're so into the digital world. I do not admonish a digital world. I think social media and everything is amazing. I make a podcast for Pete's sake. Like, come on. I do think that there's a lot of value in it. But we can't forget that human to human connection in person is extremely, extremely powerful. And in spiritual spaces, I think that there's a unique power and a unique value to that that we shouldn't give up, even if our faith is transforming. So that concludes the first half of this episode. And I hope that if you are someone who has gone through a deconstruction journey, deep questioning of your faith, whatever term you use, or you're in the midst of one, that these are some tips that help you to ponder and to really think about what your faith looks like and the kind of Christian you want to be as you figure that out. But moving in and kind of shifting gears into some other segments for the podcast, I'd like to introduce a new segment that I'm calling Not My Ministry. And this is just a sort of a mini segment where I talk about news related to Christianity or religion that I have found interesting, that I have seen come up a lot in my social media feeds or on the news, etc., and just think that would be interesting to mention on the podcast. So here we go. So this week's Not My Ministry segment will be about the Asbury Revival. So I am really, really intrigued by this. If you have not heard of it, the Asbury Revival is a revival, a Christian revival, mainly happening amongst Christian students, so the Gen Z population at Asbury University in Wilmore, Kentucky. It pretty much started on February 8th when they had a service that basically didn't end. And so the service was prolonged, and there's just been this religious revival happening with people speaking, students sharing stories and testimonies, and there's been a lot of coverage on TikTok and Instagram and social media apps. Fun fact, I'm actually taking off Instagram for Lent. So to be really honest, I have not seen a lot of the videos happening, but I have read some articles and I've also just heard about it. And this is really fascinating to me. What has stood out for a lot of people and the articles that I was reading is that Asbury University actually is sort of known for its revivals. It's had revivals in decades past, which I think is really, really interesting, particularly in the 1970s. They were known for having a really popular revival, as well as the fact that this is happening amongst Generation Z, and we're seeing in America a trend of more and more adults, especially young adults, saying that they are religiously unaffiliated or not religious at all. So it's quite eye-opening to see a group of individuals who, at least in their generation, are not known for being very religious as Christians or as anything, but this revival and this big spiritual transformation is breaking out and inspiring all of these visitors to come and see what's going on. One article I read said 50,000 people worldwide have visited the campus. I know people have said that the Wilmore, Kentucky is relatively small, and so it's been very overwhelming actually. So this is just an amazing story, and while I know that people have pointed to polls and said, hey, Gen Z isn't very religious. At the same time, I look at it and I say, well, where else would a Christian revival really break out amongst young people but at a Christian university, right? A Christian university is going to attract Christians, young and old technically, but especially young Christians. And so I'm not super surprised by this, but I do recognize like, hey, this is different and this is cool. And maybe there is some good that this could inspire people to do. There's a personal interest that I have with it because I'm someone who I left my faith in high school and I really felt like I don't have good intellectual, honest, foundational reasons to be a Christian. This doesn't really make sense to me. Peace out, right? And that's kind of the vibe that I had. And I went to college, which was a secular university, not a Christian one, but I did join a Christian group. and had a switch, had a kind of come back to Jesus, come back to faith moment. So for me, looking at something like the Asbury Revival, my thought is if this inspires or empowers anyone to come to the faith or turn their life around or find hope in some way, I'm proud of that. We can always be skeptical about motives or institutions, thinking, is this real? Is it just for show? Is it propaganda? I'm not denying any of that being possible. I'm not a spokesperson for the university, nor am I familiar with the town to really say any of that, and I have some links in the show notes if you want to dive in deeper. I also think skepticism is generally healthy. At the same time, if this revival personally changes someone's heart or life for the better, I think that that's something to celebrate. So I'll leave it there. I'm sure if you're someone who's prone to listen to podcasts like mine, you've probably heard something about the Asbury Revival. If you haven't, let me know if you have had a great spiritual transformation or spiritual moment in community that has really stuck with you. Maybe it was something that was a concert or a big moment at church or a retreat. I just went to a retreat, a Lenten retreat that my church held, and it was really spiritual and just really groundbreaking for me and revelatory for me, but there weren't any cameras and it was pretty chill, and it's not going to be on TikTok, but it did impact my spirit, right? So if you've had any kind of moment like that, global or not, I would love to know how it affected you and what it inspired within you and in your spiritual journey. So, shifting away from news a bit, this next segment is something that I typically say in a very frustrated tone when I'm not filming a podcast, but on the podcast, it's the introduction of something that is bringing me joy, and it's called our Keep Me Near the Cross segment. Something I do way too often is read too many books, consume too much TV, and use my phone. But you know what influences a lot of pop culture? Christianity. As a writer, I'm familiar with exploring my faith tradition through creative arts, and it's interesting to find Christian themes in pop culture around me. Maybe I'm stretching, maybe I'm getting a little too philosophical, or maybe I've just had a tad too much Moscato with some of these conclusions, but somehow these things are keeping me near the cross. So, on today's Keep Me Near the Cross segment, I am actually highlighting a book that got me all throughout the fall of 2022 because it's so huge, and also because I used to devour these books as a child, but me with a job cannot read as quickly as middle school me did. And that is Midnight Sun by Stephanie Meyer. Yes, a la Twilight Saga. I know people like it, hate it, criticize it for ruining vampires or being toxic. Look, unpopular opinion, but I actually don't mind vampires who sparkle. And if you ask me if I'm Team Jacob or Team Edward, I will ask you who Jacob is. I was not down for it, okay? I thought the choices were made in book one and we didn't need to have that whole argument. But anyways, while I think we definitely live in a different world than the one Twilight was first published in, I did actually find this an interesting read. It also has very strong themes of redemption within it, which is quite Christian, I'd say. Edward is like Apostle Paul levels of I am the worst person ever, right? There's a Bible verse where Apostle Paul writes that he's the worst sinner of all, or at least it's attributed to Paul that he says that. And reading a book in Edward's point of view was very depressing. Just a lot of I'm terrible, I'm a monster. And it was very, very melodramatic. But Edward's point of view focuses on his curse of being a vampire, but he meets this person of Bella who loves him unconditionally and represents someone who sees him beyond his own self-flagellation, which is quite redeeming the way that God sees us. And so this is recommended if you are too moody for the cold weather, want to snuggle up with a long read, and don't mind book covers with fruits on them. So that is what's keeping me near the cross. Not necessarily the book, okay? I read my Bible and I pray. Please take these Keeping the Cross segments facetiously. They're going to be pop culture topics, not like literal Bible studies. I know someone's in the comments like, vampires are wicked. I get it. I really do. They're also not real, so that should make you feel better. But please understand that these Keep Me Near the Cross segments are chances for me to just talk about things that are fictional that I find Christian themes in and think are really cool. So Hopefully, if you were of the Twilight gang when you were younger and you've picked up Midnight Sun, you also saw some interesting themes in it of love and redemption that are very impactful in the Christian story. So that is that. Well, friends, that concludes our time together. Thank you so, so much for tuning into today's podcast episode. This was sort of a hard episode to record and to edit. So if you love it and if you enjoy this podcast and you enjoy me sharing my thoughts here, please, please do review and rate and subscribe and share with anyone else that you think might be interested. Would really, truly appreciate that and love your time with me today. Also, hope that you enjoyed the debut of our two new segments of Not My Ministry and Keep Me Near the Cross. Not sure if they'll be on every episode or once in a while, or maybe one and not the other, but we'll see. We'll pick up a rhythm for it, but really hope that you enjoyed the taste that you got today and have an amazing day. You can stay connected with me on Instagram at faithfullyuncool_podcast or email faithfullyuncool@gmail.com for questions, topics for consideration, feedback, etc. Would love to hear from you. Have a great Lent if you're listening to this during Lent, and as always, go in peace.